As many people have proclaimed, day-to-night or night-to-day time-lapses are the holy grail of time-lapse shooting. They tend to draw the attention of viewers because of their assumed complexity. At the same time, what people don't understand is that they aren't as tough to achieve as they appear. In this section, I'll quickly walk you through a few different ways of capturing these types of shots. There are 3 different ways to approach day-to-night time lapses. You can either shoot in aperture priority mode and deflicker in post. You can shoot a shot during the day and a shot during the night and then blend in post, or you can ramp your exposure or ISO. With each of these given scenarios, there are 3 elements or settings to consider, which include your interval, aperture, and shutter speed. I'll be using case studies to help illustrate these settings. The simplest method of the lot is capturing the time-lapse using aperture priority mode. Although the simplest, it also comes with risks. First off, by shooting in aperture priority, you're relying on the camera's internal processing or metering to determine the change of exposure between day and night. Often, I've found that if I set the exposure perfect for the start of the time-lapse, that it often is either under or overexposed depending if it was a day-to-night or night-to-day time-lapse. Another disadvantage with aperture priority is that you'll more than likely experience a lot of flicker and be forced to remove in post. I primarily shoot time-lapses with Canon 5D Mark IIs, but have recently upgraded to the Mark IIIs. I've found that the Mark IIIs are much better with the accuracy of the metering, resulting in less flicker. To shoot day to night or night to day time lapses in aperture priority mode, all you need to do is set your initial exposure and your interval, and then the camera will do the rest of the work for you. In regards to your interval, there are 2 approaches. The first requires you to know how long your longest exposure will be for the given shot. Once you know that, you'll then be able to set your interval based on that number. Keep in mind that you'll need to work in buffer time as well. For example, if your longest shot is 15 seconds, you'll more than likely want to set your interval to around 18 seconds, depending on the speed of your card. The second method allows you to set your interval to something quicker. However, by doing this, when your exposure time starts to exceed your interval time, the smoothness of your motion will be inconsistent as you start to get less frames as it gets darker. Determining the exact settings is a bit of a challenge based on your given scenario, but as an example, I'll walk you through a case study. Right now I'm shooting 3 day-to-night time lapses using each of the different methods. This camera on the end here is using the aperture priority method, this camera in the center is using the blend and post method, and this camera on the end here is using the ramping method. The first thing I want to do is walk you through the different settings you need to consider when shooting using the aperture priority method. First thing you want to do is make sure your intervalometer is connected to your camera's turned on, and you're in aperture priority mode. Aperture priority mode is the AV on your dial. Once you've hooked up your camera, the next thing you want to do is determine how you want to capture that shot. For this setup, what I want to do is capture the widest range of time. So I want to have this time-lapse go for between 4 and 5 hours. By doing this, what I'm going to need to do then is try push this camera to see what are the max settings or the quickest this camera can fire to still get proper exposure during the day. So what I'm going to do is first look at my ISO to see how far I can push that. I'm going to set my ISO to 320. Then I'm going to set my f-stop to 2.8. What I'm going to want to do is open up that aperture as wide as it'll go and then take a test frame. Right now it's showing my shutter speed is 1/8,000th of a second, which is the furthest or the quickest this camera can fire. So I'm going to have a look at that image and see. It's a little bit overexposed, but because we're shooting RAW and small JPEG, we're able to bring back some of that information. So this is a perfect settings for this given shot. Now the one disadvantage for having a quick shutter speed outside of flicker is the staccato effect. That's one thing you can't really get around if you're wanting to capture that wide range of time. So that's something that you'll have to just consider when you are choosing whether or not you want to use this method or another method. So now that we know the camera settings, the next thing we need to do is determine the interval time, and that's based on two different things. The first is how long you're shooting your shot for, and the second is the size of your card. I typically use either 64 gigabyte cards or 128 gig cards for data night time lapses, just because then I have the option of capturing more frames than I would have otherwise. What I've done, I figured out that my interval time needs to be 10 seconds in order to have this time lapse, for this time lapse to go for the 4-hour period or 5-hour period that I want to go for. So I'm going to set that interval to 10 seconds and hit OK. And then I'm going to fire off about 10 test frames to make sure that this shot is how I want it to appear in the final time lapse. If I'm happy with it, then we're all good to go. This time lapse is all set up, so I don't have to worry about this time lapse until basically tearing down. What I'll do during the time lapse is come out every once in a while, hit the play button to see how the time lapse is working, just to double check that it's exposing how you're hoping it to expose. Go-to option out of the three is the blend option. With this method, you'll not only be able to ensure your time lapses stay flicker-free, but you'll also be able to track the progress of your shot. By breaking your shot into sections, you're able to shoot multiple shorter time lapses with more flexibility in post. To shoot using the blend method, you'll want to focus on consistency and repeatability. You'll need to shoot at least 2 time lapses. It's totally up to you how many you want to shoot, but 2 is the minimum. I'd recommend shooting more as the transition is smoother. However, processing does take longer when you do shoot more, and it's a little more complex when you do your post-processing, especially when shooting motion control shots. If you're shooting a static time lapse, you don't need to worry about the variance and repeatability, and you can simply layer your shots, no matter what speed they're recorded at. However, if you're shooting motion control shots, you'll want to run the same shot out in its entirety and then match the final clip speed before lining up. I'll go over this more in depth when we go into the post-processing. I highly recommend using your motion control device's internal camera control functionality to trigger your camera, as you'll be able to line up your shots easier by simply basing the variance in time from the difference in the amount of frames captured. These devices should tell you how many pictures were fired, or if your card was formatted before you actually go out and do the shots, you should be able to see in your finder how many shots were fired as part of that time lapse. Once you've lined up all the shots, all you need to do is blend between them using the opacity function in After Effects. The next setup I want to show you is the blend and post option. The first thing you want to do is connect your intervalometer to your camera and turn the camera to manual mode, which is the M on your dial, and then turn your camera on. With this given shot, what I want to do is drag my exposure a little bit longer so I take that staccato look in the trees and blend that out. And in order to do that, what I'm going to use is a Vari-ND filter. So I'm going to grab the Vari-ND filter and screw it to the front of my lens, and then dial in the filter to the max setting on the filter. Just kind of, I go to the end and then turn it back just a little bit off of max. Once I've done that, then I'll turn the live view on the camera and then kind of dial in my exposure close to where I'd want to be. For this shot, I think I'd probably want to be around 1/10 of a second, just so you get a little bit of motion blur, but it's not too extreme. So I'm going to switch these settings to 1/10 of a second. And then the next thing you want to determine is your aperture. Anytime I'm shooting a landscape, I like to be around f/16. And if you're shooting into the sun for your sunset shot, you'll also want to consider the look you want for the sun. At f/16, you're going to get that nice starburst effect. Personally, I like that, but I know a lot of people don't. So keep that in mind when you're selecting your f-stop. For this, we'll go to f/16. And we're close on our exposure. We're a little bit overexposed. So what I'm going to have to do here is set my ISO to 100. Once you have your camera settings selected, the next thing you want to do is determine your interval. And with this shot, I'm going to use an interval of 3 seconds. Typically, if you have fast-moving clouds in the sky or something like that, you can use a faster interval, but you'll want to do trial and error, figure out exactly what type of look you're wanting to go for. So I'm going to shoot 10 test frames at 3-second intervals to make sure that the shot is appearing as I'm hoping it to. And then once I have these test frames selected and completed, and I'm happy with that shot, I'll fire off the full time lapse. Now, once this time lapse is finished, what I'll do is shoot 2 or 3 more time lapses during magic hour and then 1 during the evening scene. And then for each time lapse, changing the exposure time or the shutter speed for each of the shots. Once those are completed, then we can go into post-production and show you how you blend those shots together. The last of the 3 options is bulb ramping. With this method, you're able to smoothly blend between exposures to create a smooth transition between day and night. The disadvantage of this method right now is that you need to manually ramp the exposure as the light changes using an external device. However, there are a few devices that are in development that will be capable of auto bulb ramping, and I'll include these options in the blog post as they become available. The last option of the 3 is the ramping solution. I'm not going to go super in depth on how you control these devices because each one functions a little bit differently. What I am going to do though is walk you through the different settings you need to consider with your camera and the settings you need to set your camera to in order for your camera to accept these devices. The first thing you want to do is turn the power on your camera and turn the dial to bulb mode, which is the B on the dial. Once you've done that, your camera is able to accept these devices. As for your ISO, that totally depends on the type of shots you want to accomplish. Typically, I'll be around between 100 and 640 depending on the type of shot. One thing to keep in mind about some of these devices is that the quickest it can fire your camera is 1/10 of a second, which means more than likely you're going to need to use a very ND filter or an ND filter in order to get exposure during the day. When you do that though, you won't be able to expose for as long during the night, so you won't be able to get any Milky Ways or anything like that. So we've just finished going over the 3 different case studies, showcasing how to shoot day to night time lapses using each of the different methods. What I want to do now is show you how to work with these files. So how to assemble them, deflicker them, and then add any corrections that you want to the files as well. So the first thing you want to do is import all your clips into your computer and then organize them. I've already done that here, and I'll just show you kind of how I work with these files. Obviously, you can have your own naming conventions and structures, but this is kind of how I do my projects. Typically, when I work with any project, I have 3 copies of everything. Right now, I have 2 hard drives hooked up, and what I would do is, with that 3rd copy, is I'd back everything up to that copy and then disconnect it from the computer and then just work from 2 drives. So then when I'm taking my working file, what I can do is, if I don't have access to internet, is take that working file and drop it onto that 2nd hard drive as a backup. So what you're going to notice here is I have 2 separate hard drives hooked up, and the folder or naming convention is exactly the same between the 2 of them. So if I toggle between the 2, you're going to see there's no differences between the 2 of those there. What I've also done with these folders is tagged the different folders that are part of this project. And to do that, what you do is you either right-click on the folder, or you can control-click on that folder and then go down to the label function and then choose the label you want for that folder. And you'll also notice here kind of my naming convention. So how I break down every shoot is by the shooting day. And then inside of those folders, what I do is break it down even further. So for time-lapse shoots, what I would do is break down each of the different shots into their old folders and then break out the JPEG and RAW shots as well. So you're gonna see here, I've broken out every single shot from this specific shoot into their own folders. And then I also have the renders kind of underneath them as well. And if I toggle between all these different folders, you'll see it has the same naming convention for each of those different shots. So once you kind of have everything organized in your folders, what you're going to want to do is render out your low-res JPEGs and work with those first so you can determine how or what you need to do to each of those time lapses, be it deflickering or a simple correction to those files. So I'm going to navigate to the folder for these case studies that we shot, and you're going to see that I've broken down the 3 different types of shots in their separate folders. So the shot that I shot with the little Bramper, I have in these folders here. The time-lapse that was shot in aperture priority mode I have here, and then the 4 different folders for the day to night time lapses. And if you shoot more day to night time lapses, obviously you'd have more folders. But because of this tutorial, I only shot 2. There's only those 4 folders. So once you have everything kind of broken down and labeled, what you're going to want to do, again, like I said, is process these folders and or these files, or the JPEG files. And there's 2 different ways or 2 methods of processing these low-res JPEGs. You can either use QuickTime 7 or After Effects. For this part in the tutorial, I'm going to use QuickTime 7 because when I go to assemble the raw time lapses, I'll be using After Effects. So I'll show you kind of how you assemble time lapses in After Effects when we do the raw section. So the first thing you want to do is navigate to your QuickTime 7. And if you don't have QuickTime 7, you might have to go to your documentation of your Mac install to find that version, because it's not natively installed in the latest version of your Mac OS. So I've opened up QuickTime 7, and then what you're going to want to do is go File, Open Image Sequence. And then what I'm going to do again is navigate to that folder from the shoot we just did, select that first folder, and then select the first image in that time lapse, and then hit OK. And at this point, you need to choose your frame rate. And we're going to be working in 23976 for this project. Obviously, the region you're working in will determine what frame rate you want. But typically, this is what I work with. And I'm going to hit OK here. It's going to take a couple seconds here to assemble all these images. So we'll just wait for this to finish up here. And then once this image loads up here, what you're going to want to do is export this time lapse. So to do this, what you want to do is go File, Export, and then navigate to that folder you're working with, and then name this time lapse. And what we're going to do is just name it JPEG 1 as a reference for this tutorial. And then you're going to want to choose the codec you want to work with. Now, everybody kind of works with their own codecs. If you're on a PC, you'll probably use different codec. But I'm on a Mac and find that working with the ProRes LT, I get the best results. Obviously, you can work with what you feel most comfortable with, but this is kind of my go-to solution for these low-res and high-res time lapses as well. When I'm archiving footage, I'll use a different codec, but for this, for working with files, I typically work with the LT, and then hit OK. And OK here, and then let this time lapse go. Once you hit save, you can actually close out this time lapse and wait for this to finish up. So that's pretty much all it takes to export the low-res JPEGs from QuickTime 7. If you have multiple time lapses, you can open up multiple instances of these clips and have multiple exports going at the same time. Once you've finished exporting all the JPEG sequences that you want to work with, typically what I like to do is open it up in an editing program to view these files. So for the case of this tutorial, I'm going to open up everything in Premiere. If you wanted to, you could just view these clips back in QuickTime 7 to determine what sort of work needs to be done with each of these clips. But I find when I'm working with more files that it's easier to have everything laid out in a timeline before doing any changes to these clips. Typically what I also do is, on larger edits, work with the low-res proxy files until I get near the end of the project when clips have been approved. And then at that point is when I would replace these clips with the higher res versions, just to save on time. Because I know a lot of clients won't select all the clips that I shoot, and it'll save a lot of time in post if you don't process the clips that won't actually be used in the final product. So I'm going to navigate to the folder that contained the clips that we shot for the different case studies and import those different time lapses and hit OK. And then drag these into a sequence here. Now I want to be working with a 1080p timeline. So what I'm going to do is resize each of these different clips to fit the size of the sequence. And each different camera produces a different low-res JPEG file size. So obviously, depending on the camera you're using, that'll determine the size of these files. And then the last one here. Now with this manual time lapse, because this shot was very lackluster, I was kind of fighting to see if I could save this shot or whatever. So this last section of the time lapse, I was trying different camera settings, and it wasn't able to find something that I was super happy with. So we'll just delete that, and we'll work with just the one exposure change during that manual time lapse. Now we have the 3 shots laid out on the time lapse. What I want to do here is break out the manual one, so it's just the part of the clip that we want. Typically what I would also do here is break these JPEG change of exposures into their own folder, but because this isn't a shot that I'll ever use beyond this project, I just kept it in one folder. And then we'll trim the end here because I know I did another exposure change. And we'll say that just these 2 clips are what we want to work with. Once you have these different clips in your sequence, so the first one here is our ramp, the next one is aperture priority, and then the last one is the manual time lapse. What we're going to do once you have these in the sequence is determine what needs to be done to each of the shots. And the first thing I look at always is what needs to be deflickered. And in most cases, the only time lapse that really needs to be deflickered is the aperture priority one, or if you're shooting in cloudy conditions where there is a change of light due to the change in clouds or the movement of clouds. So I'm going to scrub through the little bramper. And again here, I think I stopped this time lapse half the way through because I wasn't sure if I wanted to actually use this one here. So you'll see there's a little bit of a change here. I think I might have even changed just the white balance of it or something. But overall, there is no flicker that we need to worry about in this shot. So we can go ahead and just correct this one. Aperture priority one though, if you play this back, you're gonna see there's quite a bit of flicker in this. Obviously, the camera you use will determine how much flicker shows up when you're in aperture priority. I know a lot of cameras are a lot better than, say, the Mark II in estimating the exposures or the metering. I know specifically the Mark III is quite a bit better than the Mark II, and the D4 is also better than both of those as well. And that's what this shot was captured using. So what I want to do here is create a marker in my sequence here saying that this shot needs to be deflickered. So I'm going to add a marker and then just double click on this marker and write deflicker on it. And when you're working with a lot of clips, this comes in really handy so you can quickly determine what shots need the deflickering done to them. And then the last one here is the manual one. And again, this one is smooth because it was shot with the manual exposure for both of them. So we don't have to worry about deflickering on this. Now, what I'm going to go ahead and do next is start working with these files in both Lightroom and LR Timelapse. We can, with both the bulb ramp shot and the manual shots, just get right to the grading in Lightroom. But with the aperture priority shot, we're going to have to run that through LR Timelapse to get rid of that flicker. So what we're going to do now is move over to Lightroom, and then we'll move into LR Timelapse. So I'm going to open up Lightroom here, and I already have all my different sequences imported into Lightroom to save time. But if you wanted to import all your own sequences, what you would do is go File, Import Photos and Video. Then you're going to have this dialog that shows up. What you're going to want to do is navigate to the folder that has all your different sequences. So we're going to go to PK3, then we would go to 6613 and select these 3 folders that we wanted to import. This last one here was that one that we deleted at the end. But again, because these 3 are already imported, we don't have to worry about importing. What that's going to do is create these separate folders, and it's all broken down fairly clearly here in Lightroom, so you'll see all the different hard drives that I've worked with this catalog. And again, you can open as many different catalogs as you want in Lightroom. You can find out your own workflow for whatever works best for you. Again, we're going to navigate to this specific folder with that shot. Now, we're going to first work with the aperture priority shot because this is going to require the most amount of work out of the 3 shots that were captured. Now, The next step is going to be a little bit different depending on your workflow. You'll figure out what works best for you, but what I like to do is highlight all of these clips, right click, go metadata, save metadata to files, which is going to create an XML file for all of these different images. Because I've already been working with these files, this dialog will come up. If you haven't been working with these files, you won't get this dialog. So again, the reason I create these XML files is so when I open up this sequence in LR Timelapse, I find that it loads faster in LR Timelapse when it already has these XML files attached to them. I don't think you need to actually do that, but for the sake of this tutorial, that's the process we're going to use. We're going to let this finish up here, and then we're going to move over to LR Timelapse and open up the program. Once that's finished, what you're going to want to do is navigate to the folder that you just created those XML files for. So we're going to navigate to that aperture priority sequence. And again, how this program works is it has all the different folder structures attached. You're going to want to go to volumes, navigate to the specific hard drive you're working with, which again is PK3. Go to the specific folder, which was 6613. And then we're going to select the aperture priority raw sequence. And again, we're going to go over to Lightroom to make sure that this is finished up. And if you look at the bottom of this here, it's actually got a progress bar, so you don't have to open up the sequence if you don't want to. Again, we'll wait for this to finish up. And then we're going to move back to LR Timelapse and go click on that specific folder. And it's going to take some time here to load the directory and then initialize these clips. So we'll wait for this to finish here. You'll see it's transferring the data to the XMPs. And then once this is done here, the next step you're going to want to do is hit initialize, which is going to basically add the specific details that it needs to, or LR Timelapse is going to add those details to that given file or XMP files for each of the images. And then once it's initialized, what you're going to want to do is define the reference area that you want the deflickering to reference. So basically the part of the image that will be the most consistent section in the image. So if you have somebody walking through a specific part of the frame, you won't want to select that part of the frame. But say for us here, we're going to want to select probably this part of the sky here, because we know that any change or flickering will be monitored accurately through this section of the frame. And we'll just wait for this to finish up here. So LR Timelapse has just finished loading the XMP and loading the previews as well. So the next thing we want to do, you can actually scroll through this here to see it play through the time lapse. And you'll see there's some definite exposure changes. If you look at the graph here, you're going to see where the major changes happen. And again, if you look around here, there's going to be some major changes. So this time lapse clearly needs to have some work done to it. So the first thing that we want to do is hit initialize on this sequence, which again is going to load all the metadata for all the files. So initially what it was doing was initializing the XMP, taking all the settings that you had set for your camera, your aperture, shutter speed, ISO, and kind of determining the mean for all of that. And now what it's doing is creating the different parameters that it needs in order to make its changes for each of the files. At least that's kind of how I assume that the program works. So we're going to wait for this initializing to finish. And again, the next thing, like we said, we need to do is define the reference area. So when this finishes, we're going to select this top part of the frame here. Now the next thing we want to do is actually click on this here to select the area. If you click define reference area, it's basically just going to tell you what you need to do to select the area. So we'll hit OK here and then select this portion here. And then what it's going to do is recalculate the average brightness values. Now that it's finished recalculating the average brightness, the next thing you want to do is hit Keyframe Wizard. What you're also going to notice here is that we're going basically in line with how this whole process works. So Gunther's made it really clear kind of how this program functions. So what you're going to do is kind of follow the line. When it says to get to this point here, you're going to go back to Lightroom or Bridge, edit your keyframes, and then once you've done that, you're going to come back to this program. After you've hit Keyframe Wizard, it's going to ask you if you use the Holy Grail method. which is where you're manually changing either the exposure or ISO. So this would only apply when you're shooting your manual time lapses and you have all of those different images in the same folder. Because we shot this in aperture priority mode, we're gonna hit no for this. Once you've done that, you're gonna see that there's a bunch of different keyframes that have been added to the sequence here, which is gonna be recorded as the rating in Lightroom. So we're gonna manually go in to Lightroom and have a bunch of different keyframes marked where we can actually make different changes at these different points if we want to have specific exposure or look changes at those given points. What it's basically marking is it notices some drastic changes in exposure at these specific points. So it's either allowing you to match these different looks up to have a similar look, or if you want to do a dramatic look to it, you can do that as well. At this point here, what you're going to want to do is hit save, which is going to save all this different information that it's recorded to the XMP files. So we're going to let this finish up here, and then we're going to go over to Lightroom again. And what we're going to do at this point is reload the metadata. So we're going to right click, go to metadata, read metadata from files, which is going to grab all that information that we just finished recording in LR Timelapse and bring it up in this program. So we're going to wait for this XMP to read. What you're going to also notice is that LR Timelapse is creating a crop in all these images. And if you want to get rid of that, there's an option right in LR Timelapse to get rid of that. But for the sake of this tutorial, we're not going to worry about that. What you're also going to notice is how it's creating these stars for each of those different keyframe points that we had, or that was marked in LR Timelapse. So we'll go back here. You'll see that there's a keyframe right at the start. That's marked as a star in LR Timelapse. Now, what we want to do is separate out all these specific images with the stars, because this is what's going to affect the second line in LR Timelapse. So we'll go ahead here to filters and turn on rated, which is going to filter out just the images that have this rating attached to it. And so far, obviously, it's not we haven't loaded all the images yet, so it's only pulled up the first one. So I'll wait for this to finish up, and then we'll start editing each of these images. Once the XMP metadata has been read, you'll notice that there's 6 images that were pulled up. So these are kind of the key exposure changes during this shot. And this is kind of where you can get creative. One thing I also want to note about the Holy Grail method is that your results here will be a little bit different, and I'll go more in depth about the Holy Grail method in a future tutorial, including kind of how those shots are accomplished and then how you post-process those as well. So I'm going to go ahead now and start working with these files. And again, like mentioned, this is kind of where you get creative, so feel free to edit these images as you desire, be it making each image look very similar or creating stark differences between each of the different shots. So I'm going to go ahead here and make changes how I would like to see this image. So I'm happy with this image here. What I'm going to do now is right click on this image or control click that image, go develop settings, copy settings, make sure that all these are selected, or at least the ones that you edited are selected, hit copy, and then select your next image, right click, develop settings, paste, and again, you can go with whatever look you desire, but I'm going to stick with the same look all the way through this time lapse. So what I could actually do at this point is select all the images, right click, develop settings, paste settings. And then once I've done this, I'm just going to quickly toggle between each of these different images. Now, a lot of people have different ways in which they like to work with their images. I know some people like to do flat images out of this program, and others like to have their corrected images coming out of this program, but that's totally up to you. One thing I've noticed in this image, which what I in most situations like to fix, is this one mark in the frame here. I'm guessing that's probably a bird in this frame, but in most situations what I'd probably do is look closer into the sequence to make sure that it's not a speck of dust that shows up in maybe 4 or 5 frames. If that was the case, I'd probably get rid of it. But because it's not in either this image or this image, I'm going to assume that it's just a bird. So we'll go ahead and move forward here. So we're going to select all of these images, which is either Command A, Control A, either click the first one, click the last one, holding Shift, however you want to get to that position of selecting all, and then right click or Control click all those images and go metadata, save metadata to files. And again, it's going to do its saving procedure. And then once it's done that, what you're going to want to do is go back into LR Timelapse and then do this next line of work here. And again, like I mentioned earlier, what you want to do is before going back into LR Timelapse or into Lightroom to create your changes, you want to do this first line, follow the steps here. It says at this point you can go into Lightroom, which we did. And then from Lightroom, we're going to go and reload this XMP information, which is going to bring up the information or the exposure changes and information for those specific shots. You're going to see here on the right side for those ones we corrected, there's specific values that show up. Now, if we were to have changed those values between each shot, it would do a auto transition between those shots when we hit auto transition. But because we use the same settings throughout, when you click auto transition, you're going to see that those specific fields go away because we didn't do any changes. So for this one, we don't have to worry about that. Once you finish the auto transition period, then you want to go to the deflicker. And here's a little bit of trial and error. You'll figure out how you like to use these sliders, but typically the default settings do a fairly good job. So what we'll do is probably stick with those settings. Now, if you look over on the left here, you're going to see that there's some new lines that showed up. What the auto transition did was created some nice smooth movements between each of those different exposures in relation with that deflicker. So these two settings in conjunction have created this smoother line. So this is what the time lapse is, the path it's going to follow. At this point, what we want to do is basically save this XMP. And again, if we wanted to, we could change these specific settings, but for this one, we're just going to hit save and it's going to save this information. Once this is finished, what we're going to do is actually go into After Effects and assemble these time lapses. But before we do that, what we're going to do is apply an effect to both the raw manual exposure time lapse and the bulb ramp or bramping solution as well, so then we can import all three into After Effects at the same time. What you're going to notice at this stage, once it's all completed saving, is it's created its own line. So this is basically saying what the exposure change between each image in order to compensate for the flicker that's present and the exposure changes that are present in the image. So like we mentioned, we're going to go back into LR Timelapse. I'm going to go ahead now and basically do my looks for both the bulb ramp, or the bramping solution, and the manual shots as well. Now, once I've corrected the first image, what I typically like to do is copy these settings to the very last image in this specific sequence. So I'm going to copy these settings, and then I'm going to go to the last image and see what it looks like. And then what I'll also do in this process is paste to an image near the center of the time lapse as well, just to make sure that I like these settings for that given shot, because as you move through the time lapse, obviously the look's going to change, and it's going to be a balancing act until I find the exact look that I want all the way through the time lapse. Now, another solution, if I wanted to have that look change throughout the shot, would be to create keyframes using LR time-lapse, so then I could do a blend between multiple looks in the same time lapse. Again, the more you use each program, you'll figure out kind of what works best for you, what this kind of the style you like. Once you've corrected your images as you desire, it's key that you select all your images and then save the metadata from those changes. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Once you've corrected your sequences in Lightroom, you'll then want to open up After Effects and prepare each of these sequences. To do this, what you want to go and do is go File, Import, File, and then navigate to that specific folder you're working with, which will be 6613, and then Wide Shot, Ramp, Raw. Select the first image, make sure that Camera Raw Sequences is selected, hit Open, and then the Camera Raw dialog is going to come up where you basically need to just okay the settings that you selected in Lightroom. And then from this stage, what I typically like to do is label each of these given shots just to keep myself organized, especially when working with a lot of time lapses. So what I'm going to do is either control click or right click on this specific shot and call it Bramp. And then from here, what I'm going to do is drag it onto the sequence icon, which is going to create a sequence for that. And then I'm going to rename this sequence as well to Bramp. And then I'm going to go ahead and import the next time lapse, which will be the aperture priority time lapse, and make sure I'm selecting the raw sequences. And then again, I'm going to rename this to aperture. And typically what I would do, instead of just naming it these basic headings for each, I would name it the same name as each of the given folders, just to make sure that I stay completely organized. Again, we'll name this aperture. And then we'll import the last sequence from the case studies, which is the manual time lapse. Again, making sure the camera raw sequence is selected. Hit OK. Rename this to manual. Drag this onto the sequence icon, which is going to create a sequence for us. Rename that to manual. And then from this stage, basically what we've created is 3 separate sequences with each of these given time lapses assembled as a time lapse. That frame rate you select will be in the composition settings. And then at this point, here's where you'll select your frame rate. And we've again selected 23987. Hit cancel. And then what we want to do from this stage, or what I typically do from this stage, is export each of these specific time lapses as their own sequence. And I do so by simply going composition, add to render queue, change the output module, basically the codec that I'm going to use, depending on what type of computer you're using, be it Mac or PC, or whatever codec you're comfortable using. That's what you'll select in your video codec. I like working with ProRes 422 LT for anything outside of archiving. Hit OK, hit OK. And then we'll check our output module. So we're going to select where we want to have this saved. And because we want to make sure we save this in the same folder from that day, and I want it to show up in this area here, we're going to select this wide shot ramp raw, and we'll just add a 1 to the end. Then we'll go to aperture and repeat the same procedure. So composition, add to render queue, change our codec to ProRes LT, hit OK, OK. Change where this is going and the name of it. So we're going to make sure we go and save it. Aperture raw, we'll do 1, save. And then we're going to want to click on manual, composition, add to render queue, change the codec. And what I typically like to do too is process all these full res versions end of day once I've done all the work, and let all this processing happen during the night, so I'm not out of using this system. Because typically when you're exporting from After Effects, it's a huge hog on resources for your computer, so it'll run a lot slower, especially when you're working on laptops. So I typically like to do these renders at night. And again, I'm going to select that same name, go 1, save. And we're now basically ready to hit render on these time lapses. And what it's going to do is render out all these full res versions to work with in Premiere. Now, obviously at this point, this will depend on how you like to work with your files, but I typically like to work in Premiere with my editing. So once your sequences are rendered out, what I typically like to do is go back to Premiere and import these high resolution files. So what we're going to do is space these out a little bit more, just so we can have the high-res versions beside them to kind of show you the difference between the two clips. So I'm going to go File, Import, and then I'm going to select these high-resolution files. Because we didn't export the other ones, you're not going to see them in this folder, but we have the sequences already rendered out previously. So I'm going to import those 3 clips. And then what I'm going to do is drag each of these clips beside the low resolution clips. And then obviously when you're working with a laptop, your resources won't function as fast as it would otherwise, but we can at least get a good kind of idea how these shots look. So I'm going to resize each of these images a little bit smaller here, just so you can see each of the clips a little bit better. Move on to the next one. So if you remember these sequences prior, we'll just quickly scrub through here. Somewhat lackluster, and we'll kind of play through the high resolution ones with the color grading we have. And obviously we're getting like a lot of movement in the trees, but for the sake of this tutorial, we'll just overlook that. So you see it's not, I mean, once it's corrected, it's not the worst shot in the world. It's just definitely not super dynamic. And then we'll move to the aperture priority shot, and you'll see when you scrub through that all of the flickering is gone and there's a smooth transition between the whole shot. And then lastly, we'll go to the manual shot and just show with the look applied as well. So if we wanted to do a little bit of a blend between those two, again, we'll separate these clips like we did prior. And you'll see when you're working at quarter resolution, you're able to scrub through these clips fairly well. And these are the full resolution clips as well. So we'll say that's our shot. Close this in, and then raise this to the second layer and blend between these shots. And again, we'll go more in depth on the blending function in a future tutorial, but you get the idea here, kind of what it takes to blend between those shots. All I did was take the pen tool, which the shortcode for Premiere is P, hit P, and then you basically just click on this given line here. If you say you want to create keyframes here, you could do that, and then you just drag to where you want it to be. And then if you scrub between these shots here, you see that there's a nice blend to the nighttime scene. And you'll see it's coming in a little bit early. You wouldn't typically see this change in light happen until the sun has went down past the horizon, but you at least get the idea from this shot kind of how that transition works. So if you see this transition here is extremely smooth when shooting using the manual method, versus if you go and check out the other two solutions, which are aperture priority, you still get a nice smooth transition, but there is definitely a noticeable shift here where, again, you'll see that in the bramping. You can go to this one too, just for the sake of the shot. It's just a completely different look, and personally I like the flexibility from the manual shot. So that's pretty much everything I want to go over in this tutorial. Obviously, it's not covering everything related to shooting a time-lapse or even day-to-night time-lapse, especially the Holy Grail method where you fix your exposure changes from your manual time-lapses right inside LR Timelapse and Lightroom. But I'll either include that in a future video or the blog post. So if you have any questions or would like to find out more, please visit prestoncannick.com/timelapse.